We are continuing our series, verse by verse, through the book of James. And I know I'm going at a slower pace. I'll pick it up probably in a couple Sundays, pick up the pace some. But this morning, James 1, verses 26 and 27. If anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. Verse 27, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble. Religion is defined as a belief in and the worship of a superhuman power or person, especially a god and or multiple gods. A belief in and the worship of a superhuman power or person, especially a god or multiple gods. In Acts 26, Paul confessed he had been part of the strictest sect of the, quote, Jewish religion. In Acts 25, Festus described Judaism as a, quote, religion. And just as Judaism is a religion, in the strictest technical sense of the word, Christianity is also a religion. But it's different than other religions. Other religions are based on human tradition, ceremonies, and rituals. And sometimes, some religions are focused on other religious personalities, such as Muhammad or Buddha. The difference is that Christianity is focused on a relational connection to the one true God. A relational connection to the one true God through his son, Jesus. Christianity is more than a human religious philosophical system. Christianity describes someone that has experienced Jesus in a personal and relational sense. These verses we just read, James comments on some of the practical components to this Christian religion. Remember, these verses come immediately after the section on hearing and doing. We addressed those verses last time. Remember, hearing and doing. James has just commented on how we are to act in strict obedience to what we have learned from Scripture. So according to these next verses 26 and 27, pure religion from a Christian perspective then means to hear and do in three basic areas. Area one, we are to practice the Christian religion in our speech. We are to practice the Christian religion in our speech. Verse 26 again. If anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. Speech is mentioned numerous times in the book of James. So the tongue was a serious problem then, as it is now. James cautions us against the misuse of the tongue. James said that in a figurative sense, not a literal sense, in a figurative sense, we are to bridle the tongue. The word bridle describes the headgear used to govern or control a horse. Now, there are people in this room who have owned horses. I came from horse country in Nevada. I think horses are beautiful, but I could never afford one. And But this is what happens if you have a horse and you wish to ride the horse. You purchase a bridle. That is the bridle itself. The bridle connects to reins and a bit. And this next picture is that bridle on a horse using the reins and a bit. James said, and I might add, that headgear is used to govern or control the horse. So, James said we are to bridle our tongue, meaning we should govern or control our tongue so as not to say something we shouldn't. Control our tongue so as not to say something we shouldn't. It seems James is focusing more on the tongue's unfortunate and negative side. It's interesting that the book of Proverbs from the Old Testament Sorry, just a second here. I lost my headgear. Yeah, this is not a bridle. The book of Proverbs has more to say about the tongue than any other book in either testament, Old or New. The words tongue, lips, mouth, and words are mentioned almost 150 times in Proverbs. If we summarized Proverbs' comments about the tongue, then we see that a wrong use of the tongue falls into 6 basic categories. In commenting on the tongue, Proverbs categorizes the wrong use of the tongue 6 different categories. And because James is going to address the tongue in more detail in chapter 3, we're saving some of that until then. But this part is very important, so don't miss this. According to James 1 and verse 26, we are to bridle our tongue against these 6 undesirable things that Proverbs mentions. 1, we are to bridle our tongue against deceitful flattery. Deceitful flattery. Notice Proverbs 20, verse 17. Bread gained by deceit, to flatter someone, is considered deceitful. Bread gained by deceit is sweet to a man, meaning at first it sounds and seems good, but afterward his mouth will be filled with gravel. That's not so good. Proverbs 26, verse 28. A flattering mouth works ruin. Proverbs 28, verse 23. He who rebukes a man will find more favor afterward than he who flatters with the tongue. Meaning in the end, in the ultimate end, people appreciate sincere criticism more than being flattered. Sincere criticism can be constructive. Flattery isn't helpful at all. The word flattery means an insincere compliment. An insincere compliment is motivated from selfish gain. It is sometimes excessive and insincere praise given to someone in order to gain favor or manipulate that person. The only reason some that flatter pat us on the back is to get us to cough up something. Dale Carnegie was an author and lecturer in salesmanship, self-improvement, and interpersonal skills. He published a book in 1936 entitled How to Win Friends and Influence People. It was one of the first books published from the self-help genre. That book has to date sold more than 30 million copies. Even now, on an annual basis, it continues to sell some 250,000 copies each 12 months. The Library of Congress said it was the 7th most influential book in U.S. history. And that's impressive. I read that book some time ago, and I found some of it helpful. Not in its entirety, but some of it was helpful. That book has received some unfair criticism because some people feel the contents are insincere. As an example, the writer Sinclair Lewis argued that Carnegie's techniques instructed readers to smile and pretend to be interested in people in an attempt to manipulate people and take advantage of them. But reading through that book, I read just the opposite, because Carnegie made a distinction between genuine appreciation of someone and insincere flattery. Carnegie argued that if flattery were effective, then we'd all be expert in human relations. But flattery is ultimately, he argued, counterproductive because flattery is so easily detectable and discernible as superficial and selfish. Appreciation requires genuine inner interest in someone and sincere respect of that person. And in the Dale Carnegie course, the second principle of that curriculum is to give someone honest and sincere appreciation, not flatter them. Now, I am learning that we don't have to appreciate all that someone does in order to appreciate something from all that someone does. Let me repeat that. We don't have to appreciate all that someone does in order to appreciate something from all that someone does. As an example, there is a popular podcaster on the internet named David Rubin. David is a former leftist turned conservative. He had been part of the Young Turks network, and if that sounds unfamiliar, it doesn't get much more leftist than that. So he was a part of the Young Turks, and he became a conservative. So I've seen some of his podcasts, and I appreciate his political commentary. It seems we're on the same page often, and I appreciate his patient demeanor in interviewing his political opponents. I mean, why do we have to have this element of hate towards someone that we disagree with? He doesn't seem to have that. He is patient. He lets them speak. He responds. And I appreciate that open dialogue, that interaction among opposing opinions. I don't, though, appreciate that he's married to another man, because that is in violation of the biblical moral code. But we can compartmentalize in that sense. I can appreciate part of what he does and not appreciate his particular preference regarding sexual identity. But all of us, including me, all of us should be more appreciative of people than we are. Second, we should bridle our tongues against slander and gossip. Slander and gossip. Proverbs 10, verse 18. He who spreads slander is a fool. Proverbs 16, verse 28. A perverse man spreads strife, and a slanderer separates intimate friends. Meaning slandering someone that you are a friend to is going to divide you. Slander is defined as saying something about someone else that isn't true. Saying something about someone else that isn't true. Being slanderous is the same as sharing inaccurate and false and even malicious information about someone else. It is related to libel. Here's the difference. Slander is defamation that is spoken. It is verbal, spoken, audible. Libel is defamation in print. It is readable. In print, or a printed cartoonish picture that defames someone could also constitute libel. So that's the difference between them. Slander is just an occupational hazard to someone in the pastorate. I've been slandered here. So it doesn't bother me as much as it used to most of the time. Sometimes it does get to me. The Chicago Tribune reported that on May 9, 1994, a group of fourth graders, let me repeat that, a group of fourth graders at Fuller School on the south side of Chicago accused their substitute teacher of sexually molesting them. That was the accusation against the substitute teacher. That is a serious, serious accusation. Sometime that afternoon, the school board promised to bring in counselors for the children who had been abused. Sometime that evening, the accusations were all over the local news channels. It's amazing how anxious humans are to rush to judgment. Before the facts are in, formulate an opinion. That is so illogical. So that was the announcement made that this teacher had abused these children. But the next day, police investigators came and interviewed 14 of the children, and authorities determined that the charges were completely, utterly false. This teacher had been slandered. It was determined that the children had threatened to report, had made that false accusation because the substitute teacher had threatened to report their misbehaving. You know, sometimes in school, kids think we can get away with more with a substitute teacher, and she wasn't going to tolerate that. She threatened to report them to the principal. They were upset, and so they created this accusation that was completely false. And one of the children had promised to give each classmate $1 if they would join in that lie. The teachers' union president, Mr. Jackie Gallagher, said, But exonerating the teacher doesn't always solve the problem. He said that what usually happens is that when an innocent person, such as this teacher, is falsely accused of this kind of thing, they're exonerated by the board in public, but then afterwards, that teacher is privately let go. Slander can be a terrible, vicious crime that has the potential to do permanent damage to someone. And we are to bridle our tongue and not engage in slander. Third, we are to bridle our tongue against arguments and angry words. Arguments and angry words, such as overreacting to something in anger, such as name-calling, such as insulting accusations. Proverbs 18, verse 6, a fool's lips enter into contention, meaning a fool's words start arguments, and his mouth calls for blows, meaning a fool's mouth is going to get him beat up. Parents, understand something. If you've ever been a parent, probably this is difficult to relate to. We have 3 adult sons, and so in raising them, it was often frustrating. I'm sure girls are perfect, so we never had one of those, but we did have 3 sons and do. Understand something, parent, especially parents of teenagers. Understand that screaming at our children out of anger, screaming at our children out of frustration in an attempt to convince them to comply with our instructions is the same as attempting to drive a car using the horn. Same thing. And we get about the same results. Sometimes angry words can escalate to violence. Just this month, a video from Parkland High School in North Carolina went viral as a male student went on a profanity-filled rant. He walked up to the front of the classroom where the teacher sat and just spewing profanity. And then he slapped the female teacher in the face. And it was a violent slap. I mean, it's on YouTube. He seemed surprised that she made no effort to defend herself, so he continued to mock and run his profane mouth, and then slapped her harder a second time, and this time he knocked off her glasses. As horrific as that act was, the other students in the classroom laughed during that assault because there is a serious parenting problem in this nation. And why didn't another teenage male jump up and jump up between this assailant and the teacher in order to protect the teacher? Men should be taught from childhood that we are to protect women. And so that sort of behavior on the part of the offender and on the part of the entire class is unexcusable. So we are to be careful about arguments and angry words. Fourth, we are to bridle our tongue against boasting and verbosity. Boasting and verbosity. Proverbs 17, verse 28. Even a fool is counted wise when he holds his peace. When he shuts his lips, he is considered perceptive. He is considered perceptive. This is where we get this modern proverb we've all heard: better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. It comes from that verse. I heard about a sightseeing bus that was touring the Washington, D.C. area, and the driver was pointing out the different points of interest. The bus passed the Pentagon building, and the driver mentioned that that building houses the U.S. Department of Defense, and some 23,000 employees are in that building. That building is so massive, it consists of almost 29 acres inside and 17.5 miles of corridors. That's amazing. He told the bus, the tourist on the bus, how expensive the construction costs were and how long the construction project took. And then an older woman on the bus commented. She said in a loud voice, she said, in Peoria, where I'm from, We could have built that same building for so much less, and we could have completed it in half the time. He ignored her, drove on. The next site on the tour was the Justice Department building, consisting of 7 floors and 1.2 million square feet. And the driver, once more, cited its massive construction costs and mentioned it took more than 3 years to build. And once more, this old woman spoke up and said, in Peoria, we could have built that building for much, much less, and 3 years of construction is insane. We could have done it in no time at all. The end of the tour brought them to the huge Washington Monument, but the driver just drove past it and said nothing. Now, some of us have seen the Washington Monument. It was completed in 1884. It is 554 feet in height, 7 inches in height. It is constructed from solid granite and overlaid with marble, and it weighs 91,000 tons. It is the tallest masonry structure in existence. This driver drove past this massive structure, the Washington Monument, and said nothing. He just ignored it. This same woman, seeing that, was curious. And so she said to the driver, say, what was that tall white thing back there? Driver looked out the window, paused for a moment, and said, search me, lady. It wasn't there yesterday. The point is that for those people that are given to arrogant, exaggerated, braggadocious verbosity, please understand the rest of us just aren't that impressed. So keep it zipped. Number 5, we should bridle our tongue against profanity and vulgarity. Profanity and vulgarity. Proverbs 15, verse 4. Perverseness in it, perverseness in the tongue, breaks the spirit. Jot down Ephesians 4, verse 29. Ephesians 4, verse 29 reads, let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as it fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouth. My mother cured me of profanity as a small child. I said a word I shouldn't have said. I remember the incident. I don't remember the word I said, but I doubt it was that bad. And although Child Protective Services would probably now consider this action to be abusive, my mother literally, not figuratively, literally washed my mouth out with soap. I'd heard of that before, never experienced that before, but it happened. That turned out to be so disgusting, I never repeated that word. I am convinced that profane and obscene language, and I've been exposed to much of it. I, as a high school senior, in the summer worked on a construction crew. I heard words I'd never heard before. But I'm convinced that sort of language that is so common, even among Christians, that language is just symptomatic of someone's inferior and limited vocabulary. We can do better than that. Number 6, we are to bridle our tongues against lies and exaggeration. Lies and exaggeration. Proverbs 6, verses 16 through 19, an interesting text. In that text, Solomon said, God hates 7 things. And please notice that 2 of those things he mentions, 2 of the 7 are a lying tongue and a false witness that speaks lies. In 1993, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey ran in the newspaper a help wanted ad for electricians. In particular, a help wanted ad for electricians who had expertise and experience at using sun tag connectors. Sun tag connectors. That ad generated a total of 170 responses from men who were electricians. The problem was there is no such thing as a sun tag connector. The Port Authority ran that ad in order to see how often applicants falsify resumes. And people falsify resumes all the time. I have read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. I've been a consultant on search committees for different churches. I have read hundreds and hundreds of resumes from men wanting to pastor it. And I know for certain, I can document for certain, some of those resumes were fabricated and contained demonstrable falsehood and lies. And search teams were deceived in pursuing someone because of those lies. Even pastors can lie. And God is so displeased if we do. So putting this all together from Proverbs, and now in verse 26, James said that if our tongue is unbridled, if our mouth is out of control, and we participate in these 6 categories, then our Christian religion is useless, meaning our Christian religion has absolutely no value. If we're experiencing trouble bridling the tongue, then there are 4 steps that can help. Step 1, admit that we have a problem. First, admit to ourselves that we have a problem, and then admit that problem to God. Second, think before we speak. Think before we speak, and that is probably the most difficult of these 4 steps. We should activate our minds before we engage our mouths. I get in trouble often in things I have said because I didn't stop to think before I said them. Step 3, pray the same prayer David prayed. Pray the prayer David prayed. Psalm 141, verse 3, David said, "Set a guard, O Lord, over my mouth. Keep watch over the door of my lips." And number 4, start right now. Right now. Don't procrastinate. So the first area where we can practice Scripture, where we hear and then do, the first area where we practice the Christian religion is in our speech, using our mouths. The second area where we are to practice the Christian religion is in our service. Our service, meaning in our serving others. Verse 27, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble. Now, notice James uses 2 more words to define the purest form of religion. And those words are orphans and widows. Orphans and widows. Orphans are children who do not have custodial parents. And widows are women whose husbands are deceased. So orphans are those who do not have custodial parents, and widows are women whose husbands are deceased. Those people categories, orphans and widows, did then, at that time, and in some cases still do, represent extreme needs. Extreme needs. I'm going to add a footnote. I also believe the definition for a widow in modern times should be expanded to include women who have been victimized from an unwanted divorce, and especially those divorced women who are single mothers. This is my opinion, but being a single mom has to be the most difficult job that there is. And I believe the definition for a widow could include someone, a female who had been divorced, and especially if she has children. So God is serious about us being responsible to care for these orphans and these widows. Let me substantiate from Scripture that God has a special affinity for orphans and widows. Exodus 22. Exodus 22, verse 22. You shall not afflict, meaning not offend, not abuse, not misuse any widow or fatherless child. A fatherless child is a widow, is an orphan. Verse 23, if you afflict them in any way, and they cry it all to me, I will surely hear their cry. Verse 24, this is God speaking, and my wrath will become hot, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. So God warned his covenant people, the ancient Jewish people, in specific language, if anyone abused a widow or an orphan, that person would become the object of his intense anger, and the Jewish authorities were then required to put that person to death. Abusing an orphan, abusing a widow were considered capital offenses, which if the offender were male, and the language used in this text is primarily addressing men, and if that offending man were married, then his execution would cause his own wife to be widowed and cause his own children to be fatherless. I am encouraged, though, because there was an increasing emphasis in evangelicalism on adoption and becoming foster parents, because there is a severe shortage of families wanting to adopt children, and even a more severe shortage of families wanting to take in foster children. And I encourage adoption. I encourage foster care from a Christian perspective. The point is that even during the Old Testament age, orphans and widows were to be given special consideration. Notice, each third year, a special tithe, I've mentioned this before, was collected from the Jewish people and used for subsidizing orphans, widows, and others in need. That's called the benevolence tithe. Notice, God had a profit-sharing plan for orphans and widows in harvesting all the fields. Notice, God demanded justice for the orphan and widow. And there's a reference attached to each of these. Notice, God has a special room in his heart for orphans and widows. And then notice, God promised to bless the Israelites if they cared for orphans and widows. Now remember, in ancient biblical times, there was no health insurance, no life insurance, no Social Security benefits, no pension plans, no 401ks, no Medicaid, no Medicare, no unemployment benefits, and worst of all, there were no senior citizens discounts. It was tough. In ancient times, things were different. There were no orphanages or other social institutions to care for the homeless and the poor, but Israel had become, as a nation, a self-contained society, so the Old Testament outlined the strategic means for that nation to provide for its orphans and widows and strangers in need. But in the New Testament, things changed as the religious authorities, consisting of scribes and Pharisees, created a system. Don't miss this. The religious authorities created a system that actually benefited themselves and took unfair advantage of those persons, such as orphans and widows and those that had limited financial means. That wasn't unlike some contemporary televangelists now, especially those that are part of the positive confession movement. And I don't have time to get into the theological aberration and heretical statements of the positive confession movement, but it is an exploding movement. Those men solicit monies from aged single women, often widows, on small fixed incomes, and then use those contributions to subsidize their own extravagant lifestyles. Kenneth Copeland is a prime example of doing that. He is a self-proclaimed billionaire and proud of it. He also said, this is recent, God told him he's going to live to be 120. He's 87 now. He has 33 more years. It's amazing what we tell people God told us. God gets blamed for so much stuff. Pretty sure he won't get to 120. Copeland's televangelist friend, Jesse Duplantis, boasts about having the largest house in Louisiana. It's 35,000 square feet. And both men own multiple private jets, 4 to 5 private jets apiece. Only God knows the number of lower social economic classes of people that contribute to these men and contribute to these men's ministries. That doesn't bother these gospel of greed celebrities, though, as these men teach that monies given them are, quote, seed gifts. Planted seed gifts that God has promised to return to those donors in abundance. Sometimes 100-fold return. But that's not a biblical teaching, so it doesn't happen. In Mark 12, verse 40, Jesus said about these sorts of religious hucksters that they, quote, devour widows' houses. But as a result of doing that, Jesus said those scribes and Pharisees deserved the greater punishment because those men were taking advantage of the poor, the orphan, the widowed. Because God is opposed to anyone who abuses and misuses those people who are less fortunate than themselves. There are certain biblical principles that are applicable throughout all generations, principles that aren't time sensitive, and principles that are applicable throughout all nations and people groups that instruct us on how we are to care for the poor. And that includes those that are orphaned and those that are widowed. The first principle is that Christians are to care for people who have needs that they are unable to meet themselves. Needs they are unable to meet themselves. I don't preach a social gospel, but I feel sometimes we have to some degree become proponents of one-dimensional Christianity. Someone has defined one-dimensional Christianity as a concern for the soul and not so much for the whole person. That's not good. We probably ought to be, those of us that are conservative evangelicals probably ought to be more social conscious than we are. Galatians 6 and verse 10 is strategic. Notice, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith. The household of the Christian faith is a phrase that describes Christians. Now, notice that we are to care for those less fortunate as we have opportunities to do that. Sometimes we don't have those opportunities. And that means if someone has a need we're aware of, and if we legitimately don't have the resources to help meet that need, then that situation is not to be considered one of those opportunities for us to do good. But let's be real. We probably have more opportunities presented to us that we haven't capitalized on than most of us would admit to. But then notice we are to prioritize our doing good. Paul said, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all. Notice, especially to those who are of the household of faith. And that means we are to first help those who are our Christian brothers and sisters. Our Christian brothers and sisters, those members of the household of faith, are our first priority. And then, after that, as we are able, we are to assist those we have no spiritual connection to, meaning the unsaved, the unregenerate, those apart from God. That's the reason at our house we sometimes contribute to secular charitable causes. We, on a consistent basis, contribute to Tunnels to Towers, muscular dystrophy, annual fundraisers for local firefighters and the police departments, and we cannot even begin to count all the individual people we have felt compelled to give to that we had never met before and have not seen since. But we did that only in addition to our contributions to the church and sometimes other parachurch ministries. The majority of our giving is to the household of faith, and especially the church of the Lord Jesus Christ. And since we're here, this church receives the bulk of our contributions. There's a second principle. Under ordinary circumstances, Christians are responsible to first care for their own families. 1 Timothy 5:8. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith, the Christian faith, and is worse than an unbeliever. Some statistics do misrepresent the problem, but it is not a myth, people. Deadbeat dads do exist. In the United States, 34.1%, meaning more than 1/3 of all fathers in this nation are under a court order to pay child support to their children. That's an astronomical percentage. Just 72.9% of children from those court-ordered fathers actually do receive child support. And of the children who do receive child support, only 50% of those children receive the full amount of child support. One more time, 1 Timothy 5:8. But if anyone does not provide for his own, especially for those of his own household, he, and notice the pronouns his and he confirmed that this anyone at the beginning of this verse is a man and the head of his household. He has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. According to this verse, if a supposed Christian father isn't providing for his own underage children, and it doesn't matter who has custody of those children, that is irrelevant. If he isn't providing for his household, then God said he has essentially denied the Christian faith and he is worse than an unbeliever. Now that last phrase is on the surface confusing. That last phrase, worse than an unbeliever, is better understood as a deadbeat dad that claims to be a Christian, that doesn't provide for his own household, is worse than an unbeliever or non-Christian dad that does provide for his own household. The Christian deadbeat dad is worse than a non-Christian dad in that the unbelieving dad is responsible, and whereas the believing dad is irresponsible. I read about one of the most extreme cases of someone wanting to avoid child support, and this is sickening to read. A divorced father from St. Louis injected his 11-month-old son with blood that was contaminated with the HIV virus. And at age 7, that child was diagnosed with full-blown AIDS. That irresponsible father actually admitted he attempted to cause the premature death of his son so he wouldn't have to pay child support. I should add his payments, child support payments, were only $267 a month, plus an additional $25 a month for back support. That's a total of only $292 a month. And he refused to pay it, so he found a way around the system. I cannot even find the words to describe how sick, demented, and utterly evil that is. I also believe, people don't consider this, I also believe that a man is to care for his own household both before and after his death. Before and after his death. Death is both unavoidable and unpredictable, and I have seen countless men die prematurely and leave behind a wife, a mother, and small children, and no life insurance. No life insurance. No tangible means of support for this woman on her own as a single mom, because he didn't understand that God held him responsible to care for his household until his household was able to care for themselves. There's a third principle. And in reading this, I need to mention, this is a last-second change I made this morning. Changed it on the PowerPoint. Did not have time to change it on the note sheets since it had already been printed and stuffed. So listen carefully. Individuals that accept financial assistance from the church are to meet certain criteria. Now, on the note sheet, scratch out the words on A and ignore the blanks. Again, I don't think this has ever happened, such a last-minute change, but scratch out the words on A and ignore the blanks. Individuals that accept financial assistance from the church are to meet certain criteria. Now, what this principle originally said was true at the beginning, but is not so true now. Much has changed since then in a societal sense. Continuing this matter of supporting widows, in addition to having no other tangible support of income, Paul mentions some additional criteria a first-century widowed woman had to meet in order to receive consistent financial support from the church. The critical word is consistent, because at that time, not now so much, at that time, widows needed consistent, continuing, ongoing financial assistance from the church. Remember that at the beginning of the Jerusalem church, those Jewish widows who had received Jesus as the promised Messiah were then cut completely off from Israel's welfare system because of the intense Jewish persecution brought against Christianity. And since there was no other governmental assistance available to them, the church had to bear the full responsibility of supporting those women. That's the reason financial assistance to widows had to be consistent, continuing, and ongoing. So 1 Timothy mentions some criteria those widows have to meet. Notice 1 Timothy 5, verses 9 and 10. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number. Meaning the numbered list of those women who needed financial support on a consistent basis. And not unless she has been the wife of one man. Verse 10, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. Now, each phrase in those verses describes a criteria a widow had to meet. And altogether, there are 8 criteria there. 1, she must be at least 60 in age. She must have been faithful to her husband. She must have been well respected. She should have raised children if possible. She must be hospitable. She must have a servant's heart. She must be a helper to others who are in trouble. And she must be committed to doing all kinds of good deeds. That was then. And this is now. And things are different now. The fortunate part is that in modern times, as part of Western culture, there is financial assistance available from both public and private sectors of our society, so that the church does not now have the same degree of responsibility to care for widows as those ancient congregations did. More and more widows now are financially secure. Their husbands did the right thing, provided for them in their absence, and these women are financially okay. Some are extremely rich. Joan Kroc married Ray Kroc. Ray Kroc founded the McDonald's Corporation. There are now more McDonald's restaurants than hospitals in the U.S. Not so sure that's a good thing. Joan Kroc inherited her husband's estate, and she became a respected philanthropist. She actually gifted, get this, $1.6 billion to the Salvation Army. So overall, widows now, are much better off than widows were in ancient biblical times, especially in the first century. But the big idea from all of that is that we should establish at least some criteria for people needing financial assistance. And the reason is because as a congregation and as individual members of this congregation, our financial resources are limited. And we want to maximize on what we have available to us so that we might be a blessing to the most people possible. Let me illustrate that using the example or illustration of a pie. A pie, let's pretend, represents the total sum of our available financial resources. Some people have smaller pies, meaning some have less financial resources available to them. Some people have larger pies, meaning some have more financial resources available to them. But we each have a pie. Each time we gift monies from that pie, then we are cutting off that pie, a slice of that pie, and donating that slice to someone else. Now, if we give a piece of that pie to someone that doesn't meet the criteria that we have established, that we feel is needed to be deserving of that gift, then we have deprived another person that is deserving of that piece of pie that we just gave someone else. Because we only have so much pie. So we need to be strategic about slicing the pie and who we give that slice of pie to. If I give to someone that doesn't deserve a gift, then I'm depriving someone else who is deserving of that gift. And that's the reason there should be some criteria established for someone to be the recipient of such a gift. So as we are able, we are responsible to care for people in need. And James said doing that is characteristic of pure religion. Now, sometimes the needs are more than financial. There are also emotional needs and spiritual needs. Older people left all alone tend to feel unimportant and unwanted. Some of my earliest sermons were preached at convalescent homes. Why? No one else wanted to hear me preach. So I would go there, I would set up a service, bring someone, we had music, and so I would preach and I would conduct services, and then afterwards I would hang around and talk to the residents. I was shocked to learn that most of them almost never had someone come visit them. Even if someone had adult children that resided in the area, most of those people had been literally abandoned. People, that is not pure religion. And it is a violation of the 5th commandment to honor our parents. Have you ever bought some flowers and then stopped off at the house of a widow or shut in or visit someone in the hospital or a convalescent home just to encourage them? Many of you ever asked a single mother if you could be a big brother for a couple of hours and take her son out to do some guy stuff? The problem is we are sometimes so self-conscious, we forget that God has left us here to be others conscious. In the first 7 verses from Acts chapter 6, we learn God has designed into the structure of the church a group of selected men to assist in meeting tangible, material, and often financial needs. Those men are called deacons. And one of the primary biblical functions of those men is to meet needs within the congregation. And in doing that, assist the pastor so he can concentrate on his assigned priorities. Let me conclude. In our second church, an older woman in our congregation called the office and said she needed help. Her husband was still in the hospital after having some extensive surgery. The doctor insisted someone be at his bedside throughout the night because this man was susceptible to hallucinations as a result of the medication he was on. Now, his wife wasn't in good health. She was aged, and she wasn't able to stay awake throughout the night, so she needed some assistance. So she called me. It was late Saturday afternoon when she called, and I had a full day scheduled ahead of me on Sunday. I felt I would be doing an injustice to an entire congregation if I even attempted to stay up all night at the hospital and then preach twice on Sunday, plus attend different meetings and other appointments. So I called one of our deacons, explained the situation to him. That deacon then called another deacon, and that deacon called another deacon, and together as a tag team, those men took turns at the hospital staying up all night in order to meet this woman's needs. And because of that, I had a reasonable night's sleep, and I was able to be effective on Sunday. So we are to practice the Christian religion in our speech and in our serving others. And then there's one more thing next time. Let's bow our heads. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for your goodness. I hope this makes sense. Most of all, I hope we won't just let this go in one ear and out the other, but we will incarnate these instructions, practice them consistently. I know that's what you want, and I pray we will do that, and I thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.